There's one thing every country has in common. They all owe money. Some owe billions of dollars. Others owe trillions. And every year they borrow even more. Which raises a simple question. Who are they all paying? Most people think the answer is obvious. China, big banks, billionaires. But that's not how the system really works. The deeper you follow the money, the stranger the story becomes. Because the world isn't simply divided into borrowers and lenders. In many ways, the world is lending money to itself. That sounds impossible. But by the end of this video, you'll understand why governments keep borrowing and why the global economy depends on debt. To understand how we got here, we have to go back more than 300 years to where it all began. Today, governments owe more money than at any other point in history. But national debt didn't begin on Wall Street. It began on the battlefield. In 1694, England was at war with France. Wars were expensive. The government needed far more money than taxes could provide. Gold reserves were running low. So instead of raising taxes, the crown turned to wealthy merchants for a loan. They received a government promise. England promised to repay the money with interest. That promise could also be bought and sold. That was the birth of the modern government bond. To manage this new system, the Bank of England was established. For the first time, a government could spend money before it actually had it. That changed everything. France adopted the idea. The Netherlands improved it. The United States used the same model to finance its own future. Over time, borrowing stopped being a sign of weakness. It became a sign of trust. If investors lent you money, you had power. From that moment on, debt stopped being a last resort. It became the foundation of modern finance. Empires once conquered land to seize gold. Today, governments issue bonds instead. The weapons have changed. So has the way nations build power. More than 300 years after England issued its first government bond, debt has become one of the world's most important financial assets. The United States owes more than $38 trillion. Japan owes more than $9 trillion. And governments around the world continue borrowing every single day. Every country owes money. Every loan has a lender, so who owns all that debt? To answer that, let's start with the United States. Not because America owes the most, but because its debt sits at the center of the global financial system. Of the more than $38 trillion the U.S. government owes, roughly half is held by public investors, rather than other parts of the government. Most of those investors are Americans. Banks buy Treasury bonds. Pension funds hold them. Insurance companies invest in them. The Federal Reserve owns a large share. Foreign investors own the rest. Japan is one of the largest holders. China owns another significant share. Countries like the United Kingdom, Luxembourg, and Belgium also hold U.S. government debt. This is why many people believe America owes most of its money to China, but that's not actually true. Most of America's debt is owned by Americans. And once you understand why, the entire system starts to make a lot more sense. When the U.S. government needs money, it issues Treasury bonds. Banks buy them, pension funds buy them, insurance companies buy them. Millions of Americans own them through their retirement and investment accounts. The government pays interest on those bonds. Much of that money stays inside the country. It flows back to the same people and institutions that invested in those bonds. The government borrows, investors lend, tax revenue pays the interest, then the cycle starts again. That's why America doesn't simply owe money to someone else. Much of its debt circulates within its own financial system. And America isn't unique. Many countries operate the same way. That's why the global debt system is far more connected than most people realize. But the story doesn't end there. Countries don't just borrow money, they lend it too. Japan owns U.S. Treasury bonds. The United States invests around the world. Many countries hold foreign government bonds as part of their reserves. Money keeps moving from one economy to another. One country borrows, another country lends. Then that money is invested somewhere else. The same capital keeps circulating through the global financial system. This isn't a chain, it's a network. Every government holds someone else's promise to repay, and every promise depends on trust. The moment that trust disappears, the entire system comes under pressure. Behind every government bond is another group of powerful players: banks, pension funds, investment firms, sovereign wealth funds, and central banks. Together, they decide who can borrow cheaply and who has to pay much more. That difference can reshape an entire economy. When investors have confidence, governments can borrow at low interest rates. When that confidence disappears, borrowing becomes expensive almost overnight. Budgets come under pressure. Currencies weaken. Growth slows. That's why financial markets matter so much. Governments decide how to spend money. Markets decide how much that money will cost. And at the center of it all sits the central bank. Its main job is to keep the financial system stable. One of the ways it does that is by buying government bonds. When it buys those bonds, it creates new money. That money becomes part of the financial system. This allows money to keep flowing through the economy. It also makes it easier for governments to keep borrowing. That's why government debt and modern money are closely connected. Without government debt, today's financial system would work very differently. And as long as people trust that system, It keeps moving. The real question is, what happens when that trust disappears? The system works because people believe those promises will be kept. But history shows that trust can disappear, and when it does, everything changes. We've seen it before. In 2010, Greece could no longer convince investors that it could manage its debt. Borrowing costs surged. The government was forced to cut spending, raise taxes, and accept an international bailout. The consequences lasted for years. Argentina has gone through the same cycle more than once. Each crisis made it harder to borrow, harder to invest, and harder to recover. Sri Lanka faced a different problem. It ran out of the foreign currency needed to repay its debts. Fuel became scarce. Essential imports slowed. Political unrest followed. These crises all look different. But they shared one thing. The moment confidence disappeared, borrowing became far more expensive. And when a country can no longer afford to borrow, the entire system begins to break down. What happens next is something many people misunderstand. Governments don't usually pay off their debt. They replace old debt with new debt. Economists call this refinancing. When a government bond reaches the end of its term, the government often issues a new bond to repay the old one. The old debt is replaced by new debt. The cycle continues. That may sound risky, but for modern governments, it's normal. The goal isn't to eliminate debt, it's to keep it affordable. As long as investors are willing to buy new bonds, the system keeps working. Old debt is replaced, new debt takes its place, the cycle continues. That's why many governments don't aim to become debt-free. They aim to keep borrowing under control. And as long as investors keep believing those promises, the cycle can continue for decades. So why do investors keep buying government debt? Because for them, government bonds aren't just loans. They're some of the safest financial assets. Banks use them. Pension funds rely on them. Central banks hold them as reserves. They aren't waiting for governments to become debt-free. They expect governments to keep meeting their payments and refinancing their debt. As long as that continues, government bonds remain valuable. For the financial system, government bonds are one of its most important building blocks. Now imagine the opposite. Imagine a government suddenly paying off every bond it has ever issued. One of the world's safest financial assets would begin to disappear. Banks would lose a key source of security. Financial markets would have to adjust. That's why governments don't try to eliminate their debt. They try to keep it stable, because for today's financial system, stable debt is often more valuable than no debt at all. The entire system depends on one thing: trust. Investors trust that governments will keep making their payments. Governments trust that investors will keep buying their bonds. Banks trust those bonds will remain valuable. As long as that trust exists, the system keeps moving. But trust can disappear much faster than it was built. The moment investors begin to lose confidence, borrowing becomes more expensive. Governments face difficult choices. Economic growth slows, and financial markets become unstable. That's why trust is one of the most valuable assets in the entire financial system. Without it, debt becomes much harder to manage. And a system built on promises can begin to fall apart. In the end, the world's debt isn't just about governments, it's about trust. Government bonds, banks, retirement funds, even the money in your pocket. They all depend on one simple belief: that tomorrow, the promise will still be worth something. That's why modern debt isn't really designed to disappear. It's designed to keep moving. As long as people believe in the system, the cycle continues. But history has shown that trust doesn't last forever, and every major financial crisis begins the same way. Not when money runs out, but when confidence does. So the next time you hear that a country owes trillions of dollars, don't just ask how much it owes. Ask a different question. Who still believes those promises? Because that answer tells you far more about the future than the debt itself ever could. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing.